Hi, and welcome back to lesson number 5 of the Martin Movement Method and the Walking Code. As always, if you haven't watched the previous lessons, please go back and do that now because they are a prerequisite for this lesson. In lesson number 5, we're going to look at the core techniques of push and pulse. These are the final two core techniques which use hip extension. Let's begin with push. In the core technique of push, we're going to use extension of the active hip and torsional rotation on the same side as the active hip. And a push is exactly what you would think it would be. I'm going to push with my arm on the same side as the extending hip. I have torsional rotation on the left as I extend my left hip. You can practice this by pushing against a wall. So this is pushing against a wall with the core technique of push. The core technique of push is associated with the peripheral joint actions of flexion of the knee on the side opposite the extending hip and plantar flexion of the ankle on the same side of the extending hip. So as I do a push with the left hip, my right knee is going to flex and my left ankle is going to plantar flex. This is a push. As opposed to reach that we looked at in the last lesson, reach would be extending my left hip and using torsional rotation on the right to push against the wall. That would be reach. This would be push. In push, part of the energy pushing against the wall is coming from the hip extending against the ground. The other part of the energy for the push is the rotation of the lumbar spine from the lower abdominal muscles, also turning back, pushing the pelvis off the hip and off the ground, further causing more force against the wall. That is push. Pulse is going to be similar to push in the lower torso and the hip, but we're going to turn the upper torso rotation toward the extending hip. So we have concordant rotation of the abdominal core turning towards an extending hip. This, if I put my forearm against the wall, would be pulse. I'm turning my entire core to the left, extending off the left hip. This creates a very powerful movement because I have the energy of my upper torso and lower torso both projecting off of an extending hip. In Tai Chi, this movement is called ward off, and it's the most aggressive movement or energy in Tai Chi. The peripheral joint actions in pulse are going to be extension of the knee on the side of the extending hip and plantar flexion of the ankle on the side of the extending hip. So as I am doing a pulse with the left hip, I have counterclockwise rotation of the abdominal core, extension of the left hip, extension of the left knee, and plantar flexion of the left ankle. One example of push we use all the time when we're walking is when we step up onto a stair or onto a curb. We move from a balanced position after walking forward. We reach a balanced position and then do a push off of the standing leg, extending the hip and using torsional rotation on the same side as the extending hip. My right knee will flex automatically, as you see, and I have plantar flexion of the left ankle that you can see as my heel is lifted off the ground. So we go from set to sink to push when we're going to step up onto a curb or onto a step. A common usage of pulse in locomotion is when we're running. That powerful connection between the core rotating against the extending hip, the extending knee, and the plantar flexing ankle is what propels us off the ground when we are running. Because everything is propelling off of the extending hip and projecting forward, you can't appreciate the rotation that's happening when you're running. But it is similar to the energy when I'm pressing against this wall with my right arm turning everything towards the extending hip, you can't see the rotation. And the same thing is happening when we lift off the ground when we are running. So that is one of the most common usages of pulse. One of the most recognizable usages of push in Tai Chi is the Tai Chi technique of push. In fact, push is the only core technique whose name I borrowed from Tai Chi because its action in daily life is similar to its action in Tai Chi. In Tai Chi, one of the most commonly recognized movements of push is in grasp the sparrow's tail. We shift forward using lift. We open the arms. That is push coming from the left hip with torsion on the left. And then I push down and back using push with extension of the right hip and torsion on the right. And then we push forward again with extension of the left hip, torsion on the left. You'll notice flexion of the right knee and plantar flexion of the left ankle. So we have push going forward, push going backwards, and push going forwards. In Tai Chi, the most common usage of pulse is in the movement we call ward-off. Ward-off and pulse are the same energy. This is the motion of ward-off in Tai Chi, projecting the energy from the right arm off of the rotation of the core, which is turning towards the extending hip, towards the extending knee, towards the plantar flexing ankle. This is the movement of ward-off in Tai Chi. I'm going to skip demonstrations of push and pulse in tango because they are such dynamic movements that I can't do them in such a small space. So suffice it to have the demonstration of walking technique, push and pulse, and Tai Chi, push and pulse. This concludes the lessons on the core techniques. In the next lessons, we're going to begin to use the core techniques for walking technique.